Hello, and this is the first of what will be probably 3 videos on the Bloodborne Chalice dungeons. I wanted to do this just because there are some genuinely unique Chalice dungeon bosses that I wanted to show off, and as much as I don't really care for the Chalice dungeons, and it is a hell of a lot of content to go through, I decided I was going to show it off anyway because there's a way I can show it off without it taking too long, and also give you an idea of, like, all of the unique bosses. How it's basically going to go down is that this first video shows the first 3 Pthumerian set Chalice dungeons. The first Chalices you get are always the same layout, and by going through them you get the root challenges, which are the actually randomly generated dungeons. And the way this is going to go is that after the first one, where I show off generally the kind of layout you can expect, and the sort of things you can expect in a Chalice dungeon, layout-wise, Chalice dungeons don't really change all that much. The way they generally work is that you start off on a layer, and you have the boss room basically right in front of the lantern, but you can't access it until you go through the dungeon, exploring it and open up a lever. Once you open up a lever? Operate a lever. Once you do that, the boss room becomes openable and you can go and fight the boss. Now, I'm not going to be showing every single time I do that, because that would take so very long and it would be so boring. So instead, I have just this as an indication of what sort of layer you can expect, sort of things that pop up, with the exception of the horrible summoned spiders, which show up very regularly after this. And I just show the bosses, so it's like a big boss rush thing. As for the chalices I'm going to be showing, it's these 3 Pthumerian chalices, then it's the Lauren and 2 Hintertomb chalices, and then it's the Defiled and Pthumeria Hill. I'm not going to bother with the East and the Lower Lauren chalices because there are no unique bosses there that don't show up in either other Chalice dungeons or in the main game. So that's how it's going to be handled. I'm only going to show those chalices that have unique bosses, and of those I'm only showing the bosses anyway. Because you're really not missing much in terms of, like, Chalice dungeon layout. They're the weakest part of the game for a reason. So, with that said, the commentary is naturally post-com, because this was done months and months ago, these recordings. And how the commentary is going to go for the most part is I'm going to give a brief summary of what the bosses I'm fighting are like, if that's even necessary, because a lot of them are just reused. And then I'm more or less just going to let it play out. And I think once these are uploaded to YouTube, I will add a timestamp of some description, which will allow people to just skip to whatever boss they want to actually look at, or if they're not particularly interested in seeing me fight Bloodletting Beast or Merciless Watchers for like the 10th fucking time, which thankfully is an exaggeration, well, they can skip it. That's the idea. So that's more or less it for the description summary of what I'm going to be doing in the Chalice dungeons. So, without further ado, I will return once we get to the boss. So yeah, what you're about to see here, of course, is not indicative of the actual difficulty of the boss, because by the time I started doing these, and indeed the time I usually start doing these chalices, I am way too over-leveled for these. This guy is a total asshole when you're first going through at like a low level, but otherwise you just trance him. You'll have a variant later that's way harder, but that's I think that's in the third Pthumerian Chalice, so that's fine. And that's when I started doing those. As you can see, this was a long time ago that I did that. The next boss is a common reoccurring boss. It's the Merciless Watchers, and there's really not an awful lot to say. This was actually a second take I did, because the first time I did this, when I was doing the original run, I forgot to record it, and I had to load the Chalice up again and do it all over. Which wasn't particularly difficult, it's just kind of tedious and irritating. You have two melee watchers, and you have a guy at the back who fires a gun. And the general strategy, if you even really need one, is just sit at the back with a pillar in the way to stop you getting shot, interrupt their attacks with a gunshot, and then just visceral attack. And this guy, like, I'm sure his gun does a lot of damage when it actually hits, but otherwise he will either whack you with the torch, or the lantern I should say, or a club, and for the most part, like, you can just spam on him. It's kind of a joke. Like, even in later areas where they get tankier, it's just, they're really just nothing. The next boss is one that, at this stage, because of the fact that I approached it at such a high level, it really undermines the actual difficulty of the boss. But it shows up again later in another Chalice, and it is a very punishing fight. Just because of how wonky its hitboxes are and how much damage it can do in just one go. It can very easily one-shot you. And that's the first Pthumerian Chalice. And yeah, the music is really fucking loud and dramatic there, isn't it? I can not really gonna get a word in edgewise with that. And this is a boss that's another recurring one. This is actually an enemy that you meet at the bottom of the large tower that you climb up to get to the upper cathedral ward, or down to get to the lower cathedral ward. But this is an enemy that you don't really see a lot, because the one time you see it, you can just visceral attack it with a backstab, and then it's just dead. But if you don't do that, this is more or less what it can do. And it is a horrible flailing thing with like 5 combo attacks. It's one of those enemies in Bloodborne that can be infuriating to deal with just because of how often they attack, which doesn't make it particularly difficult, it just means you have to stand back and wait for a little longer. And in Bloodborne's case, you can do that with just hanging back and shooting them whenever they're flailing about. and you can get a visceral attack on them. Which makes it a little easier to deal with, but no less annoying. Another boss that can be particularly spammy and irritating, but this one's a little less so, and especially because of how easy it is to parry. There's a way its AI works that means that if you get in its face or do damage to it, it will do that move in particular, which becomes very easy to bait and very easy to interrupt. And so, by extension, it becomes very easy to get a lot of visceral attacks off. Especially since if you mess up, it will often do the attack anyway in response. However, once you get to later stages of the Chalice dungeons, if you mess up, it can get... It'll basically two-shot you, this boss. It's one of the common reoccurring things with the Chalice dungeon bosses is that they're not particularly difficult in and of themselves. They're just kind of cheap. Which is why going through the Chalice dungeons is just really not a particularly enjoyable experience. As you can see, it actually killed me off. Just for the sake of the quicker draw, it's probably better to go with the pistol in these cases. And that was that. The third boss, I'm trying to remember. I think it's the Pthumerian Descendant or the Pthumerian Elder? They're more or less the same model, they just use different weapons and therefore attack very differently. This guy is a very spammy bastard, just constantly going which, if you're constantly dying to him in like one of the Depth 5 chalices, just gets infuriating to listen to. But yeah, this guy has no chill. He's not even a particularly reliable boss to interrupt either, just because his attacks are either really fast or he takes advantage of his hyper armor and just hits you afterwards. So usually the best strategy is just to be dodging all the time and getting dodge attacks in, just because that's way more reliable. Especially once he gets into his later stage, which becomes way spammier. Calm down, King Allah. And we get to see these guys again. There's really nothing else to say about how these guys work. Okay, so the next one up is another iteration of the Undead Giant, but this one fights very differently, as you will see. This is similar to a later boss as well, in the sense of a boss being reused but having different mechanics. In this case, this is by far the most infuriating version of the Undead Giant, because it still very relentlessly just attacks with 4 hit attacks that are meant to like bait you into counter-attacking and then attacking you anyway, which kind of only really works a few times until you get used to it. But most importantly, this boss can hit you very easily if you're trying to dodge around the side and behind it, because it has those chains around it, and you can't really iframe through those very reliably. And when you try to, you take a lot of counter damage, which is a mechanic that shouldn't really exist in a game like Bloodborne, where you're being encouraged to dodge a lot and trade blows with the whole regame mechanic, but it's there nonetheless. So it's something you have to watch out for. So as you can see, this boss in particular, I'm being very, very careful about when I actually attack, because I know at any point, if I mess up, I can very easily be 1 or 2 shot. Which is again pretty much the staple of a lot of the later Chalice dungeon bosses. Which is why they're really not that enjoyable to fight. Because it's more of an endurance test than a test of skill and strategy. I suppose it's one of the more general issues with Souls bosses, is that once you learn their tells and their attacks, it can be very difficult to balance a boss so that it's hard but also fair. Because once you get used to how Souls bosses work, it's very easy to just sort of dodge around to the side and behind them and just basically trivialize them, because they attack so slowly. But then again, if you have a boss that attacks very quickly and his hitboxes are wonky, then you get a boss that's not really very fun to fight, because there's no consistency. You don't feel like you're being punished for messing up. You feel like you're being punished for doing what you're supposed to be doing. And that's kind of the feeling I get with a lot of the Chalice bosses. They're kind of a rather cynical and cheap way of trying to deal with what Souls players have done in the past. A lot like the Hide Knights of Dark Souls 2. What's another good indication? I suppose I like the Smelter Demon fight from Dark Souls 2, but that's an indication in terms of how the AoEs it has and the persistent damage it has, which is something that they have with Bria's as well. Although, admittedly, you didn't get to see that all that much because it died too quickly. But once you get to this stage, it becomes very difficult, because the boss gets very, very liberal with how often it relies on its chains to do damage. Just AoEs all over the place with it. So this is why I'm basically just hanging in the back and just throwing molotovs with very, very safe damage. Because that's what a lot of these later Chalice dungeon bosses become. It becomes incredibly unsafe to be anywhere near them, so you bait out very specific attacks in order to actually do any damage. Because otherwise you'll just get punished for countering, which really isn't how it should be, but that's how it ends up being. I suppose another thing to consider with bosses like this is that the iframes of your roll and timing doesn't matter as much as spacing and making sure that you're in the correct position, which I suppose is not necessarily a bad design idea. In fact, I actually quite like it. I just am a bit disappointed in its execution. Now this is of course a main story boss, but the... Oh, that was an interesting pop in there. The arena makes this a little bit different in the sense of it's actually a little bit easier because you have the pillars to block the like arcane blizzard fire that Rom pulls out later. Although admittedly at the same time you're given a lot less room to work with and escape from the spiders that you have to deal with. Again, that only really matters if you're trying to meticulously deal with the spiders each phase, and if you decide not to do that, then I mean it'd still be a problem then, because of course the spiders all congregate around Rom, so you do have to watch what they're doing regardless. But the pillars definitely make it a different fight in the sense of you have more cover to work with. So it's not so much just running around trying to avoid barrages and missile fire, rather than it is waiting behind a pillar or running to. Although admittedly, if there are still spiders around there, that can cause its own problems. But other than that, there really isn't an awful lot to say. It's the same boss. the final boss of this video, or at least I think it is. Yeah. And of the third from Chalice is the Bloodletting Beast, and this is one of those fights that camera and the way it works in Souls games tends to be quite a problem. And this is a boss that emphasizes that more than most. Yet at the same time, it's manageable if you learn to fight unlocked, which I probably do a lot more than I should now, because it does screw with me actually hitting targets that are not as big as this guy. But in this case, while the boss is absolutely fucking enormous, it's really, really useful in terms of being able to see what your character's doing and like what to watch out for, because otherwise you lose track of like where you are and what you're doing, because the camera's too busy looking up at this thing's enormous stupid face. And this boss is I mean, this boss is a nuisance to deal with no matter where you are, but especially if you're up close, not up close, if you're quite a distance away, it has a very, very hard-hitting and quite difficult to time correctly in terms of dodging a punch, as you've seen already. And of course, because it's so enormous, its hitbox for when it actually does like a sweep at you is very hard to roll out of without getting counter hit. Even a lot of what it does at close range can be difficult to dodge, but eventually you get used to the kind of things it can do, and it is worth staying up close, just because while it's not easy to dodge what it does, it's easier. All in all, I actually don't dislike this boss as much as many other people do, but that might just be down to the fact that I've just fought it so many times now. It's still not exactly a great boss. It's just manageable. This is also one of those bosses that just loves to just keep attacking almost non-stop. Now thankfully it's also another boss that suffers from locational damage, which means that it's a little easier to get openings on a boss like this, because over time you can stun it just by doing damage to specific body parts, whereas other ones like the Pthumerian Beast don't really have that mechanic. It can be staggered into a visceral attack, but it's not nearly as reliable. So that one I'll talk about a bit more in the next video, but nonetheless it's one of those cases of locational damage helps making something like this more manageable, whereas bosses without it can be very, very difficult to punish. But that's it. That is all of the bosses from Chalice Dungeons 1 through 3.